Something that has bothered me, it's been on my mind for a while, is the idea of cherry picking, but cherry picking from another angle. Cherry picking, let's say in conversation, when somebody is speaking by interruption. So one of the nuances of English is that we can shuffle sentence structure. And it's actually really useful in comedy, where it's possible to create an environment at the earliest parts of a sentence that while a person is listening, they stitch together in their mind the conclusion of the sentence. And it's like putting forth a mystery of a kind. And a person gets involved and starts doing prediction. It could be this, it could be this, it could be this. And in comedy, the punchline would be something unexpected at the end of the sentence. And it's something that I've been trying to bring out from my own speaking as a way of having what I say be more engaging. And it's a nuance that it's hard to notice and it's hard to do, but it's interesting. It's something interesting to play with. When writing, it's possible to do that, quite, I mean, I want to say effectively or something like that, but I'm not really sure. It's interesting to write. It would be interesting, like being Shakespearean about one's writing, where you've got like certain rhyme and meter and stuff like that. It's just it's just kind of fun, I guess, in sort of a sense. But in conversation, doing that is it happens, and for most people, it's just something. The structure just happens the way it happens when it happens. It doesn't really matter to shape certain sentences one way or the other way. And it's not something most people even have considered or know exist. I mean, somebody who speaks English as a second language or third or fourth, whatever, um, they will notice the difference between, well, every other language and English. English having a really weird backwards kind of way of saying, of structuring things. And I mean, I think objectively it's better to shape sentences in a certain way to actually talk about some stuff before the things that stuff does. Um, to have kind of the punchline at the end of the sentence. Um, but I totally see the perspective of there being a value of having all that stuff up front and then talking about what that, well, at any rate. So with a certain kind of sentence structure, it is especially vulnerable to interruption. And when listening to somebody else, if they are, say they've got a long point, it's difficult for them because as they're speaking, they're trying to, they're not just struggling with articulating a complex idea. They're actually struggling internally with trying to understand the intuition behind what they're trying to convey. So if you've got an idea and you're in a good conversation, good dialogue, and you are challenging the other, and they're engaged and they're trying and they've got something interesting to say, and they're saying something, and it's long and difficult and awkward, but they're getting through it, and you interrupt because of that sentence structure, because they start with a point. And if your mind is going through all the branches of possibility and goes, I understand what you're going to say, you interrupt and you finish their sentence for them. Now, in light conversation, a shy person will let that slide again and again and again. And your mid-sentence bullying by interruption will mean that they will not have made their point. Often, if you know a person really well and it's a lighthearted conversation, it's okay. I mean, it's okay because When you know, if it's your very best friend and you do that, first, that's not good. You shouldn't be doing that. But because you're so close, you will very frequently understand early and will be predicting what they have to say. But if it's a stranger or if it's a complex idea, um, even if it's your very bestest friend and it's a complex idea, that's another person. And when you interrupt that person with that complex idea, you're shutting them down. So you're taking the wind out of their sails by interrupting them. So it's your friend. You're preventing them from getting credit for what they were thinking and saying. That's bad. You shouldn't do that. And if it's a very challenging idea, and they should have the credit for having that personal growth. And if it's a stranger, it's even more important because that's an impression that people get, right? When it's contentious, it becomes even more important because when a person is interrupted in a long idea, you can get it wrong. You can get it very wrong. And if it's somebody who you think that you're having an antagonistic conversation with, or what people would call traditionally an argument, the term would be a heated argument, but an argument is just two people taking two sides and talking politely about something. It's not about being mad or anything. But so let's say heated argument. In a heated argument, it becomes even more important to listen, because often if you're angry or unsettled or something, it's very important to listen, because in the middle of a sentence, if you are riled up, it's very, very common that it's because you don't understand. And if you interrupt in the middle of a sentence, you are playing pretend like you understand their point, when clearly you don't, right? Clearly you don't. Maybe they haven't had the full opportunity to explain things, and maybe that person is still articulating things, still unraveling the yarn in their head, trying to convey things. Maybe if you just sit quietly and listen and try to understand, but try to understand and verbally sit on your hands, they'll go through their thing, they'll surprise you with where they were actually going, and maybe they'll do the full thing, and having done the full thing, they will have the opportunity to relax enough that they will then get through their point, then go, and then they'll go somewhere else. And they'll go somewhere else because they kind of, in their head, maybe they realized how dumb their point is, or they go, okay, well, I think this and this and this because this. And then you just sit quietly because you know you're right. And maybe you are, and you could have just, no, you're wrong because this statistic or something or other. But you let that person get through their point without interrupting, without choosing to know what they were concluding with. So without interrupting to cherry pick the front part of what they were saying and planting your own assumption of what they meant. And you just let them get through it. And then they come to the end. And then they have a little moment. You just wait. Maybe you don't even have to use body language to be like, and have them and prompt them. You just sit, listen. And a person can actually get through the entire thing, pause, reconsider what they just said, decide what they said is incomplete. Maybe it's because you had a good point, but then they can lead themselves maybe to your point, right? So they think through the entire thing, they pause, they think about what you've said earlier, and then they continue on a different way. And I think I do like talking about that, the problem of interruption as cherry picking from a sense of bullying a shy person. Because if you like, so shyness and introversion are different. So if you've got somebody who's really kind of stuck in their head, introverted, and somebody who is, let's say, vulnerable to bullying in general, so somebody who's shy, and they're all alone and uncomfortable with an idea, and they're not really sure how to articulate it. It's a kind of a frailty, a vulnerability that person has, that they're sitting down and trying to, like, you're working with somebody who needs your patience and your acceptance to let them open up that thing. Like, maybe it's just because they have a bunch of questions, they're not quite sure how to articulate it, and they need to just open up a little bit. And so you should just let them finish their sentences. And if you're right objectively, or you're more articulate, or you've considered the subject more, or what have you, just pause and wait. Let them be wrong in the complete sentence, and then let them pause. Now, it becomes important to sometimes make a person pause between sentences so you can address the point they just made. Interruption is really important, mandatory. If somebody is repeating your point, which you should do when you're in conversation, you should repeat what they say to make sure you understand it, because if it's contentious and you kind of get riled up, it's probably because you don't fully understand their point. Try to get there first. And when somebody says something, you repeat it. Okay, so let's reverse that. So you've conveyed an idea, you've gone through the full sentence, you've got a good point, it gets put out there. The other person, what they should be doing, they take your point and then they're working with the point. But if they're working with some other point, they're straw manning, or they just misunderstand, you interrupt immediately. Be like, I didn't say that. That's not what I meant. You can stop talking about that other point that somebody else made. I didn't make that point. I don't know where you're coming from. I'm the one that's here. I can clarify the thing that I said. Like you can be antagonistic and you can be rude about it, because it's a complete waste of every participant's time when somebody willfully or accidentally misunderstands the thing that somebody else says. So that's when interruption is, I want to say it's like it's a moral duty to interrupt somebody who's misrepresenting you. And if you are saying something and they interrupt you in the middle of that sentence, you need to know the difference between them interrupting in order to make sure that you get their point correct first before you waste the time completing a sentence or additional points, and them interrupting to play pretend like they knew what you were going to say, which means that's when there's an additional escalation where they interrupt you and they start talking over you and say, oh, well, no, that's wrong because this and this, and you interrupt them right the hell back. Let me finish. That's it. You asked me a question. Let me give you the answer before you talk. I will give you your turn. Use language like that. And somebody who just wants to talk to themselves, that when you're talking with somebody and they keep interrupting, it's like, what's the point of talking? If they're the only one talking, then they can just go in their closet and face the corner and talk to themselves. What's the point of you being there if they keep interrupting? Right? So there's a kind of interruption where it's in terms of it progressing the conversation, it is important for the interruptions to happen in a polite way where you don't want one or the other to misrepresent the point that they're trying to address, the thing they're trying to answer. And it's very important when it's a complex, poorly articulated point. And the difference between that and interrupting in order to be as a tactic to bully somebody who's shy in conversation, or somebody who's awkward and doesn't fully understand their point, or to interrupt to cherry pick what a person was kind of working through in order to insert your interpretation of what they really meant or where they were going to go with it. You know, interrupting to answer the question that you assumed they were going to make. And again, I don't know if this is a vulnerability just in English, because other languages are structured differently, or maybe there's another version of interruption that happens between sentences, because a person will have there is a natural pause between sentences. Not too many people have the verbal skill to have run-on sentences and have the pauses for breathing in between sentences, which is the right way of doing things. And you'll actually notice really good speakers will do that, like what I was just doing. Will have in between the sentences, they'll run up against one another, and the sentences are broken in the middle between their points to intentionally remove any mid-sentence interruption. Let's say it can still be done, but it becomes obvious that that person is being rude. And you'll notice, if you find some news program or something or other where there's some debate, you get some antagonistic little rebel type who's brought on into the wolf's den, and that person is a really good speaker. You'll notice that person will talk fast to get as much of their points across as possible, and their breaks, their breathing, the rhythm of what they're saying, for their long multi-sentence points, will have breaks not between sentences, but breaks in the middle of sentences. Sometimes if they're really good, it'll be done as a trap for, quote, cherry picking. They'll have something kind of, they'll know their points so well that they'll be able to present things in a way that if they are interrupted, they'll know where they're going to be interrupted and why, and they'll be able to knock down the assumption that they can predict out of somebody. Now that's pretty advanced stuff, and it would have to be, I'd have to analyze some sort of contentious argument to point this kind of stuff out. And it's a lot easier to slow it down in writing, which is something I'll have to make another video on, to actually look at how sentences are crafted for complex ideas and how multiple sentences back to back will work, and where interruptions can go. I think maybe trying to do, not necessarily, I don't know that it's storytelling, but having some points and then boiling them down and then putting them into characters and then writing the characters arguing might be a really interesting practice, at least for me, to try to understand this and maybe tactics of arguing. Because I'm not sure that there's nothing famous that I know of that has argument done like that, with that kind of understanding in mind. I'm not well enough read. I don't think anybody really is. And maybe I've just missed that there's that famous book or other. It's perfectly fine for me to learn that I just don't know, and that there is stuff out there. But I think it would be an interesting practice for me to understand that subject, and maybe it would be interesting to read. Maybe it would just be weird. Maybe it would be a useful thing, like writing is a useful thing for learning, like a life skill, like a conversational life skill, which is another thing I'll make a video on in the future. So yeah, interruption as cherry picking. I think it's an interesting idea to play with.